WCNC Charlotte. This is Flashpoint, where power and politics collide and the tough questions get asked and answered.
Thanks for joining us here on Flashpoint. I'm Ben Thompson. This week, leaders in the North Carolina General Assembly signing off on new district maps that will likely hand over a lot more power to Republicans in next year's election. But you know what? We might never know what exactly happened behind the scenes when drawing those maps. That's all because of provision in the latest state budget that significantly limits what's accessible to the public. It gives broad discretion to lawmakers to decide if a record should be made public or destroyed. Leaves it up to themselves to police. And that could make it tough for the public and WCNC Charlotte, or really any news organization, to hold lawmakers accountable to their words and actions. Joining us now is Brooks Fuller. He's the executive director of the North Carolina Open Government Coalition and professor at Elon. Professor, thanks for coming on. We appreciate it.
Hey, Ben, thanks for having me.
For the average folks at home, why should they care about not having access to public records?
Oh, broadly speaking, I mean, public records are the property of the people. Public records are government activity reduced to documentary format. This is how we learn what our elected and appointed leaders do in their respective positions. It's one of the only ways that we can find out for ourselves what the truth is of what's happening in government. So we're entitled to them and we deserve them. Because
in our process of news gathering as journalists, folks at home might not realize this, but sometimes, not always, but sometimes lawmakers at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level, Democrat, Republican, sometimes they don't like all of their information behind the conversations they have, deals they make. Sometimes they don't want that to be public.
Unquestionably. So, you know, the narrative that politicians sometimes like to put out are, you know, things that are favorable to their party or to their position, disfavorable or unflattering to their opposition. And public records are one of the ways that journalists and members of the public have access to the actual truth, documentary evidence of what's happening in government.
So I know Republicans who supported this provision in the General Assembly, they, including the Speaker, Tim Moore, said that sometimes this media requests can bog down government offices, and taxpayer money is included in it as well. He says the changes allow lawmakers to filter out those requests, sort of police themselves. Mm-hmm. Is that a fair portrayal of what this is?
No, it's not fair. If the General Assembly wanted to prioritize public information, they could allocate funds to all kinds of government offices in order to hasten the free flow of information. You know, the beauty of the public records law is that it doesn't really put the burden on the public to decide what's going to be the efficient use of government's time. It just says that public records are our property and that there's a compelling overarching policy reason for those to be in the hands of the public. It doesn't matter that we have to wait for them, because sometimes we do. It doesn't matter that we have to pay for copies, because sometimes we do. All that matters is that this information tells us what our government is up to. It tells us what our elected and appointed leaders are doing with their time and with our money, with our tax dollars that fund all of the projects and all the work that they bring into our communities. And it's that's why the records are important. It's not because they're, you know, cheap or easy to produce all of the time. Sometimes we have to wait. Sometimes it's complicated, but it's worth that wait and it's worth that complication, regardless of the fact that it may take our lawmakers a little bit of extra time and use a little bit of staff time to provide those to us. The bargain is well worth it for the public.
I think this also goes back to something we talk about on occasion, is media literacy and folks not realizing the process that journalists go through. I mean, almost any really big investigation that you see here on our air or in the Charlotte Observer or in any other major publication, oftentimes is the result of records requests. And that's how we find out our information. And sometimes, to your point, it can take months, but it's the work that we put in as journalists. What do you see as the implications of this provision going into the future?
A lot of viewers are going to know that the legislature is developing new legislative maps that decide how our state is carved up into districts for electing members of Congress, electing members of the General Assembly. And prior to the passage of this law, we could see communications that lawmakers had about that process and documents that they receive about drafting maps and all of the ingredients to this critical aspect of our representative democracy. Who gets to vote for what district and who gets to serve in what district are core, regardless of partisan leaning, to representative democracy in this state and in this country. And all of that goes into a black box under this new law. There are innumerable reasons, especially now with a state that looks like North Carolina looks, why the public should have access to that information and understand how their legislative districts get drawn. And it's no secret that we've been the target of litigation in this area. There's a lot of outside interests around the country that are litigating cases around voting rights in North Carolina. And this information, these maps and all the ingredients that go into them has been front and center in that litigation. Things that could wind up in front of the Supreme Court someday. Shielding those public records is bad for public information. It's bad for representative democracy. I can't put it more strongly than that. This is terrible for our public information.
It's just bad. Politics aside, it's just bad. It's not good for our democracy as a whole. Do you know, are there any other states or other precedent that cut off publics from access to their state house?
There are a few. I'm glad that you bring this up. So we are in a minority of states, fewer than 10 across the country, that exempt their legislators from the Public Records Act. There are a few that restrict certain types of communications, like communications with constituents. There are only 2 states who shield that. So now we are one of 3 that don't allow the public to see communications between constituents and elected leaders. So that's a very small minority. We're one of only another handful of 9 or 10 that shield communications between legislators and between legislators and their staff or other members of the public, like special interest groups, lobbyists, other folks that they might correspond with. So the vast majority of states around the country do not do this.
Do you think this rule could be overturned in the courts?
It's hard to say. I don't know of any active litigation that is challenging this law in court. Just like the General Assembly passed the Public Records Law decades ago and have sort of tightened it and loosened it in different ways in the decades since. They really have a lot of authority to decide what is and what is not public record. We do not have a constitutional provision in our state constitution that enshrines the right to know, so enshrines the right to public records. There are a few other states that do that. If we had that, there would be a more direct attack in the courts that you could bring under the Constitution. Unfortunately, that's not the case in North Carolina. So there would have to be some other sort of creative legal theories to challenge this law directly. What may get litigated out is the scope of the legislative privilege, how far it sweeps, whether there are documents that might fall outside of that privilege. Those questions remain to be resolved by the courts, but there's no active litigation right now on that front.
Well, they say sunlight is the best disinfectant, and every single person watching this should care about this, because if you like the lawmakers in your city or town or state in this matter, or you don't, you definitely want to know what they're up to behind closed doors. Brooks Fuller, the Executive Director of the North Carolina Open Government Coalition. Brooks, thanks for coming on. We appreciate it.
It was my pleasure, and thank you very much.
More Flashpoint after this.